Hi, I'm Poonam Sharma, the managing editor of India America Today, and I'm joined today by my fellow Canadian, the journalist and author, Terry Milewski, whose book, Blood for Blood, 50 Years of the Global Khalistan Project, was just released. This book is the product of many, many years of in-depth research and reporting on Khalistan and the Air India hearings in Vancouver. Terry, thank you for joining me today.
It's my pleasure. I'm looking forward to it.
Great. So Terry, initially the Canadian government treated the Air India bombing as an Indian tragedy, with the then Prime Minister Brian Mulroney speaking to Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi and condoling it as India's loss. It wasn't until 2005 that Canada declared the anniversary of the bombing a national day of mourning. And observing the 20th anniversary of the bombing, Prime Minister Paul Martin acknowledged, make no mistake, the flight may have been Air India's. It may have taken place off the coast of Ireland, but this is a Canadian tragedy. Do you feel that Canada initially treating this as an Indian tragedy affected what happened to the case many years later?
Yes, I do. I think it had a lot to do with it. I think at the outset, the reaction of Canadian officials was twofold. First, it's a foreign aircraft. It's an Indian aircraft. And they thought of most of the people on board as Indians. Actually, most of them were Canadian citizens.
That's right.
Roughly 280 of them out of 329 on board the plane were Canadian citizens of Indian descent, to be sure, but they were Canadians. Secondly, the Canadian officials wanted to avoid any liability. Their thoughts immediately went not to the victims' families, but to how the government could get off the hook for letting this happen. At first, amazingly enough, the Canadian government even argued that you couldn't prove that there was even a bomb. Maybe it was some freak accident. So don't blame Canada. That argument, of course, turned out to be nonsense, and the Canadian government denied any forewarning, any signs that such a thing was going to happen. But in fact, it turned out that there was a whole lot of warnings. There were abundant, timely, and specific warnings, which were ignored in a sort of alphabet soup of police and security agencies who didn't work together, dropped the ball, kept secrets from each other. You know how security agencies are. They can be very secretive, even, and sometimes especially from each other. So yes, I think that this certainly affected the response, and it took a very long time, far too long, for the government to accept, as you noted, that, yeah, this was a Canadian tragedy.
Right. And when there was an independent judicial inquiry announced in 2006, led by former Supreme Court Justice John C. Major, his report concluded just what you said, that there was a cascading series of errors by the Canadian government, the RCMP, and the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, which allowed the terrorist attack to take place. You talk about the ferocious religiosity of Khalistanis in the 80s and 90s who marked Hindus for death because of their religion. Sikhs who weren't devout enough faced the same fate. I'm reminded of one particular session of the Air India hearings in Vancouver, describing an incident that took place in the Ross Street Gurdwara. A Sikh woman brought her son to the Gurdwara to buy him a kada, the plain bracelet that's worn by Sikhs, because they were traveling to India and she wanted him to wear one because he would be meeting his grandparents and other relatives in India. That woman and her son, they both died on Air India Flight 182. Now, I don't remember now who it was that commented that they deserved to die because they were not true Sikhs and were just following Sikh customs for appearances. That was terrifying for all of us who were listening to that hearing just to hear. So tell me a bit more about this religious.
Maybe fanaticism is the word you're looking for.
Is the right word.
It certainly was evident in as it were, the patron saint of the Khalistani movement in Sajjanal Singh Bhindranwale, the father figure of the Khalistan movement. It wasn't much of a Khalistani himself. He wasn't a political man. He wasn't campaigning for Khalistan. He was campaigning, in fact, for a more rigorous Puritan form of Sikhism. He railed more about smoking and drinking than he did about Khalistan. And people who tried to engage him in political discussions to try to get him to lead a more overtly Khalistan movement generally failed. The incident you mentioned is another reflection of this, as I call it, religiosity. The testimony you're referring to was actually about one of the accused at the Air India trial, Poonam Singh Malik, alleged to have paid for the bombing.
That's right.
A wealthy businessman. And he was said to have said, look, these weren't real Sikhs. Here's an example. This woman was only buying a bracelet to make sure the grandparents weren't upset. They weren't really dyed-in-the-wool Sikhs. Of course, nor was he, by the way, when he first came to Canada. He got religion, as it were, after he came to Canada. There are many other examples of the rampage of Khalistani terrorists inside Punjab, where if you put a foot wrong, it doesn't matter if you were yourself a Sikh. You were also a candidate to be wiped out or machine gunned or bombed in public places or in a bus. And that is one of the reasons why most of the victims, the very large pile of victims in this Khalistani insurgency during the 80s and the early 90s, most of them were Sikhs. They included, for example, Sikh policemen who were fighting to preserve order in the state, and members of their families murdered by the dozen, by the hundred, in order to discourage people from joining the police. And KPS Gill, the Sikh policeman, who effectively conquered that insurgency in the early 90s, by the end of 93, say, he noted, having counted all the bodies from the figures from every police station all over Punjab, he counted 21,000 victims, of which 60% were Sikhs.
And Bhindranwale, who you, as you write in your book, chided Ujjwal Dosanjh for cutting his hair as well.
Yes, that's right. Dosanjh, in fact, was one of those who did try to engage Bhindranwale in a political conversation, visiting with his children to show them the old country from Canada. He was a clean-shaven, educated lawyer, went to the Golden Temple, and his sons were, he has 3 sons, they were asking him, Dad, why do these men have weapons in a holy place? You told us the Golden Temple was the holiest place of the Sikhs. There are men going around with AK-47s. What's that about? And their father said, well, that's a good question. And he challenged Bhindranwale at his daily open house, if you will, and in front of the assembled congregation, tried to get him to talk about, what were his political views, what were his political ambitions. And Bhindranwale didn't want to engage. He was more interested in the fact that Dosanjh had cut his hair. And he said that made Dosanjh a bastard. And he was really, he threatened to cut Dosanjh's throat, pointing to the armed men around him, saying, we could cut your throat for that. So cutting throats was okay, but cutting hair was not.
Right.
So that gives you a flavor of how this religious fanaticism had a lot to do with it. I don't say it has everything to do with it. There were indeed Khalistanis who didn't have this additional affliction, but it was certainly at at the root of the struggle. There's no question that this was an anti-Hindu movement to get back at the Hindus, to get revenge at the Hindus, as one of the accused at the Air India trial put it in his speech in 1984, at the height of the troubles in New York, to the founding convention of the World Sikh Organization: "Until we kill 50,000 Hindus, we will not rest," unquote. That's what that was all about.
You write in your book, the curse of Khalistan doesn't have a favorite party. It dooms them all. And if we look at Canada, I mean, even today, Parmar's, Talwinder Singh Parmar's image is proudly displayed in the Dashmesh Darbar Gurdwara in Surrey. But I wanted to get to what happened with the 2018 public report on the terrorism threat to Canada. Could you go into that a little bit?
Well, that's an embarrassing episode, as I would suggest, most particularly for one party, the party that was then in power, but similar episodes happened with the other parties. It's not a left and right thing. It's not a liberal conservative thing. They all do it. They all pander to the Khalistanis. And that's one reason they don't point the finger and object when the others do it, because they have no standing to do that. Everybody does it and they all know it. So they don't criticize each other for it, which is another reason why it continues. And what I mean by it is this pandering, whereby Khalistanis in Canada, keeping the flame of the cause of independence alive, are very well organized and diligent about developing their political influence by helping out aspiring politicians at election time. Say, look, we've got our agenda, and we want you to help us. And in return, we're well enough organized that we can bring you thousands of votes. What do you say? And the politicians say, bring it on. I'm your friend. I will look the other way when we go to the Vaisakhi parade and posters of Talwinder Singh Parmar, the leader of the Air India bomb plot, and thereby Canada's worst ever mass murderer, are paraded in the Vaisakhi parade, garlanded with gold tinsel, making him out to be a hero, a model to Sikh youth, a martyr of the Sikh nation. This man butchered more than 300 completely innocent civilians who had nothing to do with any actions by the Indian government against the Sikhs or anything like that. He didn't care who he was killing. There were more than 30 Sikhs on the plane, more Sikhs dying in this supposedly holy cause for the Sikhs. So the fact that they all benefit, all the parties benefit, and play footsie with the Khalistanis at election time means, as I say, that they tend not to criticize each other for doing that, which means that the whole thing goes on. Nobody objects.
Right.
And so then when something happens, like the World Sikh Organization led a lobbying campaign to edit the public safety terrorism report, which you mentioned, to take out the threat, to edit out the threat of Khalistani terrorism, then the politicians say, oh, well, we want to keep in the World Sikh Organization's good graces. We want to please them in the hope that they'll help us again in the next election. So yeah, they'll take it out. They'll edit it and score one for the World Sikh Organization. They succeeded. Political influence works, and they're very good at keeping it.
Right, and this is the spinelessness that Ujjwal Dosanjh talks about when he says, yes, we're on the way to becoming a nation of panderers and politically correct people, and that's almost spineless. And he himself has been a successful politician who's never needed the support of these people, and you have pointed out in previous interviews and writings that it doesn't, they can take a stand. It won't yes, affect votes. It won't affect them getting elected.
That's right. It's a very important point that for all that I've just said, that there's this you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours arrangement between the Khalistani lobby in Canada and the various political parties, it's not really based on reality, because if you examine the record, you will find that the Sikhs don't go out and vote overwhelmingly for the pro-Khalistani candidate, because most Sikhs want nothing to do with the World Sikh Organization. The vast majority are not interested in these old country politics. That's one reason they live in Canada. They're done with all of that. It's a bad memory. Remember that in Punjab, their homeland, it's a really bad memory. Those 21,000 dead were their uncles and cousins and aunts and families and wives and daughters. So if you look at the record, for example, you mentioned Assange, probably the most successful Sikh politician of his generation in Canada, always since he first came to Canada, clean-shaven, secular, but still a Sikh. His father was a Sikh. His grandfather spent years in British jails fighting for British independence. Pretty good Sikh pedigree, if you want to put it that way. He was elected and re-elected for 20 years in Canada, both provincially, rising to the post of Premier of the province of British Columbia, and federally rising to the federal cabinet as Minister of Health in the Paul Martin government, despite the fact that he openly, and many did it not less than openly, many of them didn't have his guts, to put it bluntly, right, despite the fact that he openly condemned the violence and went against a very threatening small minority of Sikhs who wanted to pursue a violent course of action in their fight against India, and who threatened his family with death repeatedly, hounded them, left messages on their answering machine, we'll kidnap your wife, we'll kill your children. And he carried on, and he was re-elected every time, which tells you something. His riding, of course, was a heavily Sikh population. Vancouver South was his riding when he ran federally. So you can't tell me that, you know, it was what he was doing was somehow anti-Sikh. It was anti a small minority of violent extremist Khalistani Sikhs. And that's a key point we may get to if you like. It's often as though when you take on that small minority, they always complain, oh, well, you're anti-Sikh. And it's as though the government put out an ad against drunk driving, and you were told, oh no, you can't do that because that's offensive to all drivers. No, it's about drunk drivers, not all drivers. Or if I say I condemn white supremacy, oh no, you shouldn't say that because that's against all whites. No, it isn't. It's against white supremacists. You're talking nonsense. But that is the nonsense that you encounter, and even Assange himself, a Sikh, encountered, when criticizing the small minority. They pretend that the entire Sikh community identifies with them. And I thank you for raising the point that in Assange's case and many others, turns out that's not true.
Also in your book, you write Sikhs were not aliens in India. They weren't before partition, and they aren't now. And in a recent Pew Research Center report on the survey of religion in India, 95% of Sikhs said they're very proud to be Indian, and 70% said a person who disrespects India can't be a Sikh. In such a scenario, what makes the Khalistani idea still survive amongst the diaspora in the West, especially in Canada, the UK, and the United States?
It is a puzzling question, and I wish I had better answers for you. It's true that enormous majorities in India reject the whole Khalistan movement. You may recall that there's a section in my book where I discussed the voting results
Right.
in the last Punjab election.
Minuscule, not even.
Yeah. I mean, it's, you know, the outcome has been microscopic in terms of their share of the vote for the last 30 years. I mean, an entire generation has grown up that has never even thought of voting, although you're free to vote to run as a separatist, a non-violent separatist. They can't get any votes. Last time out, they got 0.3% of the vote. So not quite 1/3 of 1% of the vote. It's absolutely as close to zero as you can get. In fact, none of the above got a higher vote total than the separatists did.
Right.
So why does it survive then so well in the diaspora? Well, that doesn't mean that it isn't still a small minority. And the evidence is that it is indeed a small minority. Just that that small minority is organized. They're smart about the media and politics, as we've already discussed. And their memory of India, since many of them for years were banned from visiting India by the Indian government, which identified them as Khalistanis. Well, you're not getting a visa to visit the old country or your family. They didn't realize, they weren't familiar with what India is like. India's grown up with, you know, they've had a Sikh president. They've had, the last prime minister was a Sikh for 10 years. A Sikh of great distinction, Manmohan Singh. So I think that the isolation outside India of the diaspora to some degree accounts for the survival of the Khalistani idea in the diaspora, because they're not really clued in on what it's really like in India, where millions voted for Captain Amarinder Singh, for example, as the chief minister of Punjab, a fervently anti-separatist Sikh. And finally, I should say that the small minority is self-selected. The diaspora is self-selected to be, they didn't want to live in India. So naturally, the people who are not in favor of India would tend to be greater in number in the diaspora proportionately than they are in India. And as I say, I wish I had better answers for why it survives. But we've already discussed the principal one, which is the tolerance and pandering of mainstream political parties. That they can prosper in that environment where the Sikh majority is not involved in politics. They're doing the same thing as the rest of us. They're trying to get to work on time, raise their families, whatever. Where that is the case, and it is the case in Canada and elsewhere in the UK, the US, Germany, wherever there is a large proportion of Sikh immigrants, they simply opt out of politics, and that leaves the field clear to those who wish to manipulate it.
Right. And like you said, it's a small minority in very, very minuscule minority in India and overseas who support this movement. So, you know, if they want Khalistan, I don't see the diaspora moving back. I mean, they moved away from India for a reason. It just,
yes, that's right. They're not moving back, and a lot of people will say, "Well, look, the cause is dead. You know, this is interesting history, but the cause is dead." Well, not exactly. Bear in mind that there is now a very active lobby group trying to organize a referendum,
right, the Sikhs,
as they call it, on Sikh independence. They're extremely active on social media. They organize rallies and protests, and they vilify the Indian government. And they talk about 1984, what they call the Sikh genocide, the massacres of Sikhs, the inexcusable massacres of Sikhs that followed the assassination of Indira Gandhi in 1984. And so they keep it up. But in addition, there have, in the past 2 or 3 years, been some half a dozen killings, actual murders, inside Punjab, which the police suspect may have a Canadian angle, meaning that money was paid, money was raised to pay the killers in Punjab, and money was raised in Canada. So far, I haven't seen indictments in one case directly attributing crimes in India to Canadian personalities or to Canadian money. But there does seem to be evidence in a number of cases, so many, in fact, that when Mr. Justice Patel of the Delhi High Court had to rule on the government's ban on this group Sikhs for Justice, which is campaigning for a referendum, he cited a number of actual criminal cases which the government was able to show were brought against people who seemed to have contacts outside the country, and notably in Canada.
Since we're on the topics of Sikhs for Justice, now they've aligned themselves with China and Pakistan against India. You've reported in your book, they sent a letter to Imran Khan, Prime Minister Imran Khan of Pakistan. They also sent a letter to China's leadership saying that we're with you and, against India, that we support you. And I know a lot of their website is banned in India. In fact, one of the interviews that our late editor and founder Tejinder Singh did with Gurpatwant Singh Pannu was banned on YouTube by the Indian government. So if you're in India, you can't see that. But you published the their map of the proposed Khalistan in your book, which includes many states of India, but not an inch of Pakistan, which is surprising, as many areas of importance to Sikhism, such as Nankana Sahib, the birthplace of Guru Nanak, and Kartarpur Sahib, where he was laid to rest, and which is very, very close to the Indian border, are in Pakistan. So it's somewhat surprising, but not really, as you mentioned in your book. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Well, it is a puzzle, and it's extremely hard to explain, except for the fact, and it is a fact, that Pakistan has been the lifeline for the Khalistani movement since it began 50 years ago. Even when Khalistan was just an idea in the mind of Jagmeet Singh Chauhan, living in London in 1971, and hearing from the then Pakistani leadership that, we need to get back at India over the Bangladesh war in December of 71. We need to get our revenge for our defeat at the hands of India. So we'd like to tear off a piece of India, just as Bangladesh was torn off and became no longer East Pakistan, but an independent country. So we'll help the Khalistan movement. Well, it is extremely revealing. It's not just puzzling, is it? It's extremely revealing that with all of the places you've mentioned a few, I mean, Lahore was the capital of the Sikh Empire 200 years ago under Maharaja Ranjit Singh, a legendary figure, not just in Sikh history, but in Indian history. Kept the British at bay better than a lot of others for his entire reign, in fact. It was only when he died that the Sikh Empire was slowly absorbed into the British Empire. But that's ancient history. How do you explain now, today, that with all of that Pakistani Punjab history, Nankana Sahib, you also mentioned, how come the Khalistanis do not claim 1 inch of Pakistani territory, because they're very free with the territory that they claim on the Indian side. They say they're going to end India's, quote, illegal occupation of Punjab, but not Pakistan's. So why is that? Well, it's very hard to explain unless you admit that they can't do without Pakistani support. They simply can't trespass on the generosity. They can't presume upon the generosity of Pakistan without jeopardizing the only country that has sustained the Khalistan movement for all of these 5 decades.
And for people who claim to be supporters of Sikhism, and it's, for this reason, they haven't been able to, or they don't protest against the treatment of Sikhs in Pakistan, the abduction of young girls and women, forced conversions and attacks on gurdwaras. You don't hear anything about that.
And that's very odd too, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
You're right to bring that up. I mean, remember that at the time of partition, in Punjab as a whole, but what is now India, what is now Pakistan, including it all, there were about 2 million Sikhs resident there. Now in Pakistan, it's down to a few thousand. Well, why? What happened to them? Answer: they've been driven out by the abuses against all religious minorities in Pakistan that you described. I mean, you speak, for example, of the forced conversions, abductions of Sikh girls. There are something like 55 or 60 cases over that last couple of years. And then if Sikh families try to get their girls back, there's been attacks on gurdwaras. Even Ranjit Singh's statue has been defaced. It's only been up 2 years and it's been defaced twice already.
Right.
People took a hammer to it and knocked his arm off. And I mean, he was a heroic figure in the history of the entire region. So I think that this only adds to the case. It becomes more than a suspicion at this point that Pakistan is playing, and as it always has, a crucial role in providing safe haven for the Khalistani movement, places where they can train,
Mm-hmm.
hide out, get medical care, and muster and then smuggle across the border into Punjab. It's been happening since 1971.
What's your advice for India? What should it do, or what can it do to educate the world on the dangers of this approach?
Well, the Indian government has not scored a great success, has it, in the propaganda war over this. They have been unable for many years to convince Western governments to be more proactive and more aggressive in cracking down on the Khalistani movement, in part because they always had very weak answers on the difficult questions that they faced in reply. Take 1984, for example, an enormously sensitive subject for the Sikhs because of the massacre that we mentioned after the assassination of Indira Gandhi. Well, did the Indian government have a good answer? Answer: no, they did not, because for decades went by when the cover-up continued. Did the Congress party come forward and say, yes, we admit and we will confront and seek accountability for those members of our party who encouraged, winked at, aided, and were complicit in those massacres? I didn't hear that, did you? Nobody heard that. They kept up the cover-up. The police, likewise. It pains anyone to say, the police were standing by letting it happen in many cases. And they too were complicit, and they too, they covered up for each other. So when the Sikhs reasonably raised this as an example of government oppression and discrimination against Sikhs, guess what? they were right. And so it's only really been in recent years that this long denied, long delayed justice has started far too late to be realized. Now, Sachin Kumar, for example, I believe is still in jail, old man now, of course. You know, justice came very late and insufficiently.
Mm-hmm.
It's only been in recent years that Manmohan Singh, a Sikh prime minister, was the first to stand up on behalf of the nation and apologize, as qualified as the apology may have been, but still, it was something better than nothing, you have to admit. So for that reason, among many others, the Indian government, well, they could only really step up themselves and say, look, the killings by Sikh terrorists are intolerable and disgraceful, if they also admitted that the killings by Hindu mobs were also intolerable and disgraceful.
Good
And
point.
what have they got? Answer, they've got a situation nowadays where Sikhs routinely refer to those massacres as the Sikh genocide, and almost nobody knows about the 21,000 killed in Punjab. Much greater numbers of Sikhs and Hindus murdered in Punjab. All of those Sikh policemen and all of those Sikh policemen's families and the Hindus dragged off buses and machine gunned in the ditch. People don't know about that. The Sikhs, frankly, have done a better job of propaganda, of making their case.
They're winning the
Because
narrative.
they were handicapped, the Indian government, it seems to me, was unable to make that case because they didn't want to talk about the massacres. Well, you can't have it both ways. You can't be silent about one massacre and make a fuss about the other. It's got to be both. And it's only now, really, that the Indian government has officially admitted all of that and confronted all of that. That would have made it more persuasive in previous decades if they'd said, look, to Western governments, we admit the errors of the Congress Party and of the police, and we're going to put people in jail about it. We're going to pursue them aggressively in court. We're going to do something about it. Then fairness would have required that Western governments say, okay, well, now we're going to listen to you.
So Terry, after your report, Khalistan, a project of Pakistan, came out last year, there were reports of 50 Sikh scholars asking the Macdonald-Laurier Institute to retract the report. The names, interestingly, included those of supporters of Kashmiri separatism, like Dr. Hafsa Kanjwal and Dr. Idrissa Pandit. Do you think there has been an active effort to link the Khalistan project with Kashmiri separatism?
Yes, there certainly has been on the Pakistani side, where going back to, you may have noticed in the book that I discuss at some length the details of the death of Talvinder Singh Parmar, the founder of the Baba Khalsa in British Columbia and the leader of the Air India bomb plot, or the Kanishka bomb plot, as Indians know it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was notable that he died in the company of 5 other gunmen, 2 of whom were Pakistani agents, 1 Kashmiri. And in the files of the investigation, you will find detailed evidence of the close links, common training, common strategy between Khalistani militants and Kashmiri militants. It's the so-called K2 strategy. We're stronger together. We both have a common agenda to, at the very least, bleed India, to make trouble for India. Kashmiris don't care if Khalistanis get their own country. Khalistanis may not care if Kashmiris get theirs, but they both care if they can double their effectiveness by working together, and they certainly did. For Pakistan as a geopolitical matter, of course, that's equally essential.
Mhm.
The Pakistanis were hardly backing the Khalistan movement because they're romantic about the Sikhs and they love the Sikhs and they want them to have their own country out of the goodness of their hearts. Quite the reverse. In the words of Jagjit Singh Chauhan, the father of the Khalistan movement himself, the Pakistanis were cynically exploiting the Sikhs. They just wanted the Sikhs to make trouble for India, to get back at India, to keep India on the back foot in the long-running geopolitical contest between these two arch enemies. So there's, for everyone involved, the Kashmiris, the Khalistanis, and the Pakistanis, working together simply made sense. It's been remarkably ineffective, certainly in recent years, because if you're going to support an independence movement in Punjab, there needs to be an independence movement in Punjab. You can have all the strategic reasons you like for helping them out, but who's they at a time when they get a fraction of 1% of the vote? There's no there. The actual movement wanting independence in Punjab has died out to the point that the people outside trying to promote it have no one to work with. And that's, I think, the fact today. But I don't think anyone's ruled out the utility for the Khalistan movement of the alliance with Kashmiris and more broadly with Pakistan-based jihadis or Islamists in general. As you have seen, for example, I think I have a picture in the book of Gopal Singh Chawla, a prominent Pakistani Khalistan activist, Sikh activist living inside Pakistan,
Yes.
cozying up to Hafiz Saeed, the mastermind of many jihadi operations, including the attack on Mumbai.
Mm.
And so they haven't finished trying. They've just had very little success lately.
Right. Well, this book is dedicated to the families of those murdered on Air India Flight 182 on June 23rd, 1985. And I remember when the verdict in this case was announced and the families walked away with nothing, no justice, and no closure. Thank you for joining me today, Terry. And I really enjoyed your book, Blood for Blood, 50 Years of the Global Khalistan Project. It's a must read for anyone who wants to read a well-researched, factual account of the Khalistan Project. Thank you for joining me today.
I enjoyed it. Thanks very much.